I'll just kick things off, Lucy, by saying thank you so much for agreeing to give up some of your time this Friday morning, the end of the first week back in January, which obviously we've just spoken about how hectic it is. Really appreciate you giving up some of your time to join us for a show of The Responsible Edge.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a lovely way to spend a Friday morning.
Excellent stuff, Lucy. Well, you're saying that now. Let's see whether or not that's the case when we get through 45 minutes. Lucy, as you know, with our show, we always like to start by giving our listeners a bit of a deep dive into your background and history and experience through the lens of corporate ethics, responsibility, and sustainability. Start wherever you like. I mean, we literally have guests who go back to formative childhood experiences that affected them in a particular way, relating to their experience of nature, etc. But start wherever you like. Let's have a flavour of you.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a wide question, that one, isn't it? I probably will go back to childhood because I've always been very curious, I suppose. Probably annoyingly so for my parents. I think I used to spend every car journey saying, "Why is that? What's that? How did that happen?" And my mum used to feign being asleep as soon as she got in the car, so my poor dad had to answer all the questions. And I decided that I wanted to go to university. And I'd been really interested in geography at school, and I really liked science, and actually came across geology as a subject. And initially, when somebody suggested it to me, I remember thinking, God, it's just looking at rocks, isn't it? And the more I looked into it, actually, I ended up doing a course called Earth Sciences, which allowed me to keep a science focus on things, but also, importantly, had really cool field trips to lots of different parts of the world. So if I'm honest, that's probably the thing that swung me the most as a teenager, wanting to see the world and travel. But as a degree went, so I did my undergraduate at Oxford, and it was brilliant because, yes, we got to go to all of these kind of living classrooms effectively. We spent time up in Scotland, we went to Spain, we went to Greece, and I'm somebody who's a very kind of visual learner. And the whole thing about geology and earth sciences is understanding how the world around us actually works. So, we had modules on climate change taught by some of the leading climate scientists in the world. We're looking at evolution and, the evidence for all the mass extinction events that have happened previously and, what the one that we're currently in looks like. And for somebody who's just really nosy and likes understanding how things work, it was fantastic for me. And at the same time, when I was at university, I also got involved with a little charity that used to do health and sanitation or support health and sanitation work in different parts of the world. But I was lucky enough to go on a trip to Uganda. And then I ended up running the NGO whilst I was a student. And then after I left university, I stayed involved as a trustee of the charity. And so that was kind of the first foray into, okay, what does sustainability and what does a kind of just transition and growth actually look like? And, there are a lot of charities when I was a student that would just send students out to a school somewhere remote. People would go in and teach for 2 months and have a lovely time, but they'd be displacing the local teachers. They wouldn't be teaching the local curriculum. And actually, okay, they got a great experience out of it, but what benefit did that really imply locally? Whereas the charity that we worked with, which is called Little Big Africa, who are amazing, it was all community-led projects around health and sanitation that they really wanted to support their community. So whether that was putting in new wells, water tanks for schools, and, we were there effectively to raise money for it and then facilitate it happening and then help provide some training to people so that they can maintain it and, provide a legacy after we'd left after our nice little holiday. And that was a really interesting look at, okay, there's very different ways that you can look at calling it international development is probably a bit rich, but, there's a lot of people out there trying to do good, but actually, are they having a positive impact on what they're looking at? And
Lucy, sorry to interrupt you, but you're running this charity, Little Big Africa. You're running it whilst you're at university, or?
So we had Little Big Africa was run by an amazing lady called Debs, based out in Uganda.
Right.
We had a charity at the time, it was called Oxford Development Abroad, where we partnered with local charities or NGOs who were doing work. So we had a partner in Uganda that was Little Big Africa. We had another partner in somewhere in South America. We had another partner somewhere in Central Asia. So the model was that we would partner with people who are on the ground. We weren't driving that ourselves. Yeah.
But you got a chance to actually visit Uganda, presumably. Did you do, or are there any of these other sort of satellite initiatives that were going on? And how you mentioned that you were a visual learner. Like, what was the impact for you of seeing firsthand, the result of the work that you were doing? Presumably that was very important for you as that type of learner.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was really, I got to go out to Uganda for a few months after my first year of university, which was amazing. And I think the key takeaway from me was actually that kind of quite rapid realization, that awful idea of like the white savior coming in and doing stuff. People know what they need much better than you can come in and guess for them. So it really kind of drove home to me the need to work with local communities. If you can facilitate things happening, that's fantastic, but you shouldn't necessarily be dictating what that is and coming in with your vision of what's best. So that was the main takeaway from me. And, it was amazing. We were living in one of the most beautiful places in the world I've ever been to, on the foothills of some mountains in the east, right near the Kenyan border. We met some incredible people and it was a fantastic experience. But that was probably the key takeaway from me going forwards.
Fantastic. Yeah. I'm here, I think, to having not implementing a tone deaf approach to, we're going to roll in and we're going to tell you guys exactly how things need to be done, but we're actually going to listen and support and affect things that way. Beautifully positioned. So you're now at the end of university, your undergraduate degree. You've done 2 months or so in Uganda, living in this beautiful part of the world and being inspired. But what do you do next?
So I decided that I wanted to use my degree for something practical. Mm-hmm. I think out of there were 28 of us on my undergraduate course. I think at least 20 of them went on to do PhDs. The academic world was not for me. Fair play to people who do. But I actually went down to the Campbell School of Mines, which is part of Exeter University. And I spent a year doing a master's in mining geology. And for me, that was just brilliant because my undergraduate had been really quite academic, probably not surprisingly, but my master's was very much focused on, okay, how do we actually apply these skills in the real world? And as a geologist, I do love rocks. I like shiny things. So, mining sounds great. But actually, finding a mineral deposit takes a lot of skills, takes a lot of expertise. That's only the start of it. And what the master's course really opened my eyes to was, well, how do we look at the environmental impacts associated with these projects? What are the social implications of what we're doing? How do we actually value these mineral resources? What engineering skills, what engineering design do you actually need to get them out of the ground? So actually starting with the rocks is only one small part of actually these projects coming to fruition. And the mining industry, deservedly so, has quite a bad reputation historically, has quite a bad reputation in some parts of the world still. But fundamentally, we all need minerals. We all need all of the products of mining. We all use them in pretty much everything we do every day. And actually, in the developed world, we use way more minerals than people in the less developed world do. And so, although, mining can have a very bad reputation, as I went through the master's year, I'd gone to do the master's because I had a really strong interest in the technical side of how do we find these deposits. I finished my master's thinking, okay, how can we do this well? We need these products. It's not always extracted well. It's not always extracted to the benefit of the local communities where these projects are. It's not always extracted in an environmentally responsible way. How can we do this better? And I was lucky enough to get a job straight after my master's course with a company that was based just outside of Oxford, but had exploration projects kind of across Africa. So I then spent the next few years doing exploration geology, like very early stage exploration for base metals, so things like copper and tin, as well as silver, gold in Morocco. And I also got to spend some time out in Ethiopia, up in the highlands. And that was amazing, really.
Lucy, there's a common thread here back to your teenage your observation that you wanted to do things that allowed you to go on some fun trips and some interesting places, which I know is not the overarching driver, but there is a commonality, isn't there, throughout your early experiences. A couple of questions. You mentioned is it right in just me sort of summarizing that on your master's degree, you were very aware of the historical view of the mining industry. You were very aware of, as you alluded to, it being done poorly and the implications of that. Is it too simplistic to just say that you saw yourself as wanting to try and contribute to the solution, to a different way of approaching mining that perhaps could alleviate some of those problems? Is it too simplistic to put it that way as your ambition and intention?
I'd say that I definitely left my master's with that ambition growing. And, a lot of that credit is due to some of the brilliant lecturers that we had on the course who kind of showed us all of these implications and how that can be done. I'd be lying if I said I started the course with that ambition. I was just more interested in the technical side of things. But yeah, I definitely left the course having had my eyes opened. And then over the next few years, working in different parts of the world and, finding out more about the industry, you realize that there are some brilliant people who are really trying to do this really well. Mm-hmm. And there are some people who really are driven by the money and don't perhaps care quite as much about the impacts that they're having on the ground.
And out of interest with that, Lucy, you again, just trying to draw experiences together. You mentioned, how when you were working with Little Big Africa and you were seeing and observing the need to not be the white hope, as you've alluded to, and going in and telling people how many things need to be done. When you then went and had these other experiences throughout Africa working on these mining exploration projects, how did that help you sort of within those experiences? What were the things that you observed in that period that were common or developed as a result of that initial insight that you gleaned from Uganda?
So the company I was working for had a good model whereby actually we would always make sure we were working with local teams on the ground. So again, that same thread of in Morocco, we had a couple of fantastic Moroccan geologists and a country manager. She was brilliant. Mm. And in Ethiopia, we had a whole team of local geologists. We always tried to hire local people where possible in the camps that we were setting up for doing our exploration. And I suppose looking back at it with a lens through the experience I've subsequently had over the last 10 years, there are probably a few things I would do differently. But I think so much of that comes down to experience. And, I was going out there with my colleagues as geologists. We were doing very early stage exploration. So in Morocco, for example, we were often the first time somebody come to explore. And there was quite a lot of interest in what we were doing. And perhaps with the lens I've got now, I would probably make more of an effort to communicate that to the local communities. And it's very hard because people see you turning up in trucks, going out with your rucksacks and your rock hammers and bashing stuff, and they just instantly assume that there's going to be a mine here, and they don't want that. Whereas the reality is that's so unlikely. You're just trying to build up a picture of what is actually under the surface. Where are these mineral deposits? What do they look like? You'd be absolute. I think the average time from finding a mineral deposit now to turning it into a mine globally is about 16 years. And that's once you've found a mineral deposit. There can be a decade or more of work to define that mineral deposit beforehand. And actually, it's, finding minerals in areas where they're kind of concentrated enough to make it economically viable to extract them is quite rare. Mm-hmm. And so it's highly unlikely, really, that somebody coming to have a little look and fash a rock outcrop, that's highly unlikely to actually turn into a mine. But communicating that, people's minds obviously run to the worst case scenario as they might view it. And I think there's definitely more that can be done around that.
It's fascinating, Lucy. I mean, that lines so much with, it's applied in different contexts, yes, but the whole notion of proactive disclosure and how that can liberate you, in that example, in other examples, to then act and then communicate authentically. So yeah, I can understand that would be a good reflection point. Talk us through. So at this stage, this is the company that you're working for in Oxford or outside of Oxford. You've had a few years working on these projects. What happens next?
So I decide that I'm ready for a change. And I actually moved back down to Cornwall, which is where I'd done my master's, because I'd fallen in love with living next to the beach. And I was lucky enough to join a company called Cornish Lithium, just as Jeremy Rathall, who's the founder of it, was starting to pull together a team. So Chris Harker, he'd employed as head of exploration. And I kind of joined on the team as the first geologist. It's in 2017. So that's actually quite a long time ago now, nearly 8 years ago. And it's been a hell of a ride, to be honest, with Cornish Lithium since then. So Cornish Lithium's seeking to develop lithium projects down here in the southwest of England. And lithium is the lightest weight metal, and it's a really key component of batteries. So a lot of people would have heard of lithium-ion batteries. And, they seem to be the main technology that's powering EVs, electric vehicles, at the moment. So this global demand for lithium has really been rising, pretty dramatically over the last few years, and is projected to over the next decade or two as well. And at the moment, the UK imports all of its lithium. Wow. And, we use a fairly significant amount of it. The car industry and the car manufacturer is quite important to the UK economy. And we have decent lithium deposits down here in the southwest of England that, Cornish Lithium's been instrumental in delineating, I suppose. And it's been really exciting.
And Lucy, we'll come on to talk about a little bit more about Cornish Lithium towards the end of the show, but are you guys, and sorry, I'm going to get my technical terms completely wrong in this, but are you mining yet? Are we extracting? No. Okay.
No. So we're still a few years away from commercial extraction, but we've got a demonstration plant, which is up and running at the Hard Rock project that we've got. Mm-hmm. So that's a fairly decent scale, actually, of operation. So we are, fairly imminently going to be producing the battery-grade lithium hydroxide product on site using the same process that we will use at the full-scale plant in a couple of years' time. So we kind of are producing lithium, but we're still a little way from commercial production.
Interesting. And it sort of makes sense of what you described earlier in terms of the length of time that takes for these things to actually come into existence. But your role at Cornish Lithium, you are sustainability focused, aren't you? Or have I misunderstood? Perhaps you can just give our listeners a bit of a flavour of what your role is at Cornish Lithium.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. My role has evolved from geologist to now the ESG and sustainability manager at Cornish Lithium. And I suppose I've been lucky that my interests in how can we do this properly? What does it look like? What does that actually mean on a project level? I've been able to develop that as I've been with the company. And so what kind of falls under my remit is the sustainability reporting. So, we're a private company. We're not in production yet. But we have voluntarily produced a sustainability report for the last 3 years. And we're moving forward to that, aligning with some of the global standards and frameworks. We now collect a lot more ESG data, because obviously if you're not measuring things, you then can't manage them. And we also have kind of ESG teams within the two halves of the business as well. So looking at how are we compliant, what does planning and permitting mean, how can we develop the relevant consents that we need? And there's a lot going on, really.
And what's that been like for you to sort of, to develop? I mean, you throughout the career that you've described before, you've obviously been focused on the geology. What has it been like for you, sort of adapting or adopting and working on the sustainability side of things?
I suppose I'm definitely someone who's probably more of a jack of all trades rather than a technical specialist on one thing. Mm-hmm. So it suits me to have that broad overview of what's going on. And I think one of my strengths is making connections and linking things and having that big picture view. And, as we're moving through to developing these projects and building a mine, trying to keep in mind, well, actually what design choices can we make now to make sure that the project, when it's in production, is going to be better from this perspective. We've just been working on a life cycle assessment, for example, based on the process flow sheet for the mine when it's at full scale production. And that work has led us to revise how we're going to be using steam within it, what water we could recycle, for example, whether we're going to actually produce a certain co-product or not because of the impact that might have. And, there are lots of tools available to us now. And it's been really interesting to actually be able to apply them to a real life project rather than just talking about it, if that makes sense.
Indeed. And it's interesting you picked out the kind of the E of the ESG, if you like, then. And I think I'm curious to ask a question around that. But I want to ask you a question that kind of, I think, draws parallels to your other experiences of looking at the kind of social impact of the work that you're doing, the charity work that you previously did, etc. How has that played a role in terms of, it's a very different context, isn't it? Working within a developed nation, thinking about the social impact of the work that you're doing at Cornish Lithium compared to what you did in Africa. But just touch on what the considerations are from your end in the S.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the mining industry, we talk about social license to operate, which is this kind of intangible. You can't measure it, but you know when people support you and you know when they don't. And that's really important. And right from the start at Cornish Lithium, we've been really proactive about going into local communities, going to schools, explaining what we do, and having drop-in sessions for the project to try and keep the local community as updated as we can about what we're doing. This is all coming into really sharp focus, actually, with one of the projects at Cornish Lithium now, because it's been designated as a nationally significant infrastructure project, which kind of means that planning is determined nationally by the planning inspectorate rather than locally. Mm-hmm. But it also means that there's a lot of community engagement kind of upfront. So the next few months are going to be very busy for us from that perspective. And I suppose we want to be visible. One of the big differences as well, and I'm not making excuses for people who, fly in, work remotely and come back. We live in these communities. I need to be able to walk into the pub and hold my head up high and have an honest conversation with people because there is literally no hiding from it. People know who you are. I also think the context, as with everything, that the context around where projects are is so important because communities around where projects are different. And we find that even in Cornwall, we've got a hard rock project up near St Austell, which is in amongst where China clay extraction has been happening for hundreds of years. The geothermal projects that we've got are in a different part of Cornwall where, previously lots of tin and copper was extracted, but that hasn't happened for 30, 40, 100 years. And so those communities are very different and have different needs, different wants, different makeups. And I think understanding that context really is key.
Fascinating, Lucy, and the nuance, if you like, of those different attitudes and different experiences is you've laid that out perfectly. I'm going to ask you one more question before we move on to the article. You alluded to the fact that at the end of your master's degree, you kind of began to sort of, I guess, be inspired. I'm putting words in your mouth here, but you were inspired to think, well, the mining industry is one that I want to be part of the solution. I want to be part of helping it to develop and evolve and become, more sustainable and more long-term in its thinking. When you think about, I'm putting you on the spot here, but when you think about Cornish Lithium and you think about the work that you're doing to prepare and where you guys are at, are you excited? Are you optimistic that this approach to mining is adopting those principles that you were hoping to see set out those years ago when you were doing your master's?
Yeah, absolutely. And, part of the reason for that is we are based in the UK. We've got pretty stringent regulations. So from an environmental compliance perspective, we really do have some of the highest environmental standards in the world. So it's almost a given for that. But socially, we really are trying to be proactive and put information out there and give people the opportunity to feedback on it and, shape what these projects look like. And then I suppose in parallel to that, something that people use passionate too much, but it really means a lot to me to try and encourage the next generation of young people to consider, well, STEM careers, but also mining, because, you know, we've got such a big challenge ahead of us with climate change and this energy transition, and minerals really do underpin that transition. Without the raw materials to build our solar panels and our wind turbines and things like that, we literally can't do this energy transition, which means mining is going to be more important than ever. We're going to be mining more materials over the next 30 years than we have done for a long time before that. And because of its reputation, mining's kind of quite often lumped in there with oil and gas. And actually, what can we do? What's our responsibility to get the message out about what we're doing and why this could be a really interesting career, but also why we need people from different backgrounds and with different experiences to actually get involved in it? Because I'm rambling now, but there's that definition of insanity, isn't it? It's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If we've got the same people with the same kind of backgrounds coming into these things, we're not going to have creative solutions developed to these problems. So actually, you know, the mining industry is not known for being particularly diverse. How can we get more females in? How can we get people from different backgrounds to consider going into the industry? And there are some brilliant groups doing great work within this. So one of the volunteer groups that I've been involved with for at least the last 10 years is called Women in Mining. Mm-hmm. And they're really doing fantastic work to build networks of women with lots of different experiences. And we're trying to encourage school children to consider the industry through various initiatives and supporting students through university and things like that. But yeah, coming back to how can we implement real change, we need to also have that forward-thinking view of there's a hell of a challenge ahead of us. Mm-hmm. Who are we going to bring on that journey to actually allow us to tackle it?
Here. I think that's a brilliant call to arms, if you like, Lucy. One last question. We've obliterated our. No, it's on me because I'll keep asking you questions. But hopefully you're happy to go on. When you get towards the end of your career and you look back on the way that the mining industry has evolved since you've been part of it, what do you want to be able to say about that change?
Oh, yeah, I knew you were going to ask this question and I didn't manage to think of a good answer to it. I suppose I'd just be really proud if I can look back and say that I've made the bit that I've been associated with a better place to be, whether that's for people and, you know, bringing up the next generation of really smart, interested people with me, and helping to try and shape the projects that I've been involved in to actually genuinely be developing in a way that's decent for the environment, minimizes those impacts, maximizes the benefit for the communities that are around them, and, you know, treats people well. I think if I can leave the little bit of the industry that I've been associated with better than I left it, then I think I'd be really proud of that.
I have and a very good objective and vision to have for yourself, Lucy, I think. Right, we've gone nearly 30 minutes of talking about you and your background, which hasn't even done justice to us. So we'll have to get you back on to explore that in a bit more detail, Lucy. But for now, let's move on to I think it was the article in the Associated Press from the end of last year. Would you mind just providing a bit of a summary of the article for our listeners, and then perhaps just picking out for you whatever the most interesting or salient points were from the piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So the article was talking about how in El Salvador, in Central America, they have actually lifted the mining ban that they'd imposed in 2017. And so that mining ban was brought in due to lots of action by environmental groups and international NGOs who were concerned about human rights abuses that have been occurring in the industry. And so El Salvador actually became the first country to completely ban metal mining back in 2017. So there is now a new government in place and they have voted to reinstate that ban. Not reinstate the ban, sorry, reinstate mining. Mm-hmm. And this has been, from what I've read, pretty strongly supported by various people within government. But it's still quite controversial from the perspective of environmental campaigners and human rights campaigners. There's quite a lot of fear that the new laws are going to lead to more environmental damage and also more social conflict. The government have come back at that, saying that they're putting in new measures to ensure that environmental standards will be much higher, projects will be monitored much more closely, and that those human rights abuses won't happen. So, yeah, it's definitely an interesting article, and it really is the gnarly edge of the mining industry, because it's not all good. It definitely isn't.
And what's your overall take, Lucy, on whether or not this is a good or a bad thing?
I mean, I think that it's a good thing overall, as long as it is done properly. El Salvador isn't one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And actually, there's a lot of evidence out there. I think the UN, when they look at their sustainable development goals, mining, mineral extraction, if it's done responsibly, can contribute positively to all 17 of the UN SDGs. And doing it properly really is the key part here. And that's where really exciting things like governance and policies become so important to actually ensure that that happens in real life. If these mineral deposits are developed responsibly, if benefit is conferred from them, so, money is invested through taxes into the local infrastructure, ecosystem, training of people so that they've got skills that mean that they can be employed in the industry safely, but also, importantly, transferable skills so that because mines only have a finite life, right? It's normally a minimum of 20 years, but it might end after that 20 years. If people can then have those skills that they can transfer to other industries, that can be a real benefit. Likewise, environmentally, you're extracting a finite resource. There is always going to be impact locally. It's hard to say that there won't be, but that can be really well managed, minimized, mitigated, and restored and rehabilitated afterwards to a post-mining land use that could actually have real benefit for the local communities and let them generate income from that landscape afterwards. So mining can be done really well, but it's just ensuring that that actually does happen. And, El Salvador, prior to the ban being implemented, there was what was it called? I think it's called Pacific Rim mining. Mm-hmm. It was a very controversial gold project within the country. And there was a lot of activism against it, a lot of concerns that they weren't behaving appropriately. And it ended up with, I think, 3 environmental campaigners actually being murdered. And then, knock-on effects seem to have led to this ban being implemented in 2017. That is awful. That's totally not okay. No wonder there's so much activism against it. So, yeah, I think that
right.
I'm cautiously optimistic that if these new measures that have been put in place are sufficient and robust and will be upheld, then this could be a good thing. But it comes with all of those caveats.
And isn't the danger, Lucy, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here because that's what I'm supposed to do, but isn't the issue or the concern here that, as you alluded to, like El Salvador is not one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and ultimately what they've seen here is that there's an economic opportunity, and realize, well, if we're not based in the UK, we're not based in Cornwall, we're not based under these strict regulations and requirements, and actually that there's going to be a temptation to do things in a way which sort of falls back to pre-2017, the experiences and the ways of working that led to the ban itself. Is there, are you confident that the lesson, I mean, I know we're not privy to the internal workings of the El Salvadorian government, but when you look at a developing nation like this, doing this sort of thing, are you confident that it'll be done right?
I mean, again, it massively depends. What is the expertise within government to, make sure that they're partnering? Because I'm assuming it's probably going to be international companies coming in to look at developing these mineral resources. There are, you're probably familiar with the Equator Principles, for example. So this basically is a risk management framework that's used to assess what the environmental potential risks are, what potential social risks are, for big projects such as mine, but can be other big infrastructure projects as well. And quite often they're adopted by financial institutions. So more often than not, it is expensive to build a mine. And until you get to the stage where you're producing your copper, your silver, your gold, whatever it is, all of that time is just spending money. So you need quite a lot of financial backing. And more often than not, people will take on debt finance to help them build a mine. So actually, if they're using international sources of debt or looking at the World Bank or somebody like that to fund the mine, they will quite often have to adopt the performance standards from the International Finance Corporation. And, these are a really set framework for how you assess what your potential risks are. How are you going to mitigate them? How are you going to manage them? And they go into a lot of detail, for example, specifically for mining projects and what those sector-specific more probable risks might be. So there are frameworks out there. There's a lot of expertise out there for doing it properly. It just depends on whether, as you say, there's the will and the knowledge within local governance to make sure that you're partnering with companies that are doing it properly, and then that you have the levers to ensure that they're doing it properly within government.
Lucy, a very good point. I think the one of the things that the article looked at and talked about was the relationship. It was the law, I think, requiring joint venturing between private companies and the government. I have to admit, as soon as I read that, I was slightly fraught with concern, if you like, over, well, what conditions do you want in order to, within a developing country, and I'm not throwing mud at anybody here, but within a developing nation, to have that sort of disclaimer and thinking about possible corruption-based issues. Is that, again, are there best case sort of examples that can be drawn upon, that can be used to sort of mitigate and protect from that sort of circumstance occurring? Or is it just simply the nature of the beast in the sense of a developing nation looking to act this way?
I'm sure there are. No examples spring to mind immediately. I suppose the one thing we can look at, and arguably not a developing nation, but Norway and the way that the state developed their oil and gas resources when they were found, they managed that incredibly well. And Norway has benefited hugely because they've responsibly used their natural resources. That's against, if we take the fact that they're fossil fuels, and we now know what the impact of producing those and burning them actually is, the benefit that the country has actually had from the exploitation of those natural resources has arguably significantly benefited all the people that live there, and will do for generations to come, and is now allowing them to invest, if they wanted to, a bit more in offshore floating wind, for example, and all of those renewable energy opportunities. So there are models for using your natural resources responsibly and for the benefit for generations to come. But you're right, there's always a risk of corruption and people looking to benefit themselves in the short term, perhaps, rather than long term.
And I think one of the things that, again, in the article, kind of thinking about that point, which you brilliantly responded to, the hope I have is, I think that the scrutiny that the government are going to come under, due to, I think the article alludes to the fact that the majority of Salvadorians, if I've got that correct, probably haven't, are pretty opposed to mining in the country, and therefore, in order for the government to sort of be held account, that or likelihood of them being held account is sort of higher. The scrutiny is on them. So, from a point of view of how they look to engage with those private companies that come in, it's going to be very foolish of them to enact in any way that's going to stoke the fire, if you like, of the general population. So just thinking through that, again, I'm not a geopolitician, so I'm not necessarily suggesting I know what I'm talking about, but it feels like that kind of, that balance will be there. Would you concur with that, or do you think
I'd hope so. But going back to what we started the conversation with, really, in talking about how can you work with the communities where the projects actually are, the ones who are actually going to be impacted day to day by a mine being there, to ensure that they are actually getting benefit from it, meaningful benefit. You're going to be, if the sentiment really is that against mining, people coming in to try and open up new projects are really going to be on the back foot. And there's perhaps a huge education piece that needs to be done as to the benefits. And people need to see tangible benefits. They need to be getting wealthier. They need to be seeing more opportunities. And I don't think until that actually happens, it's that chicken and egg. How do you do all that the other? I think it's going to be potentially quite hard for these companies to actually win support on the ground. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't get their licenses and go into production. It's going to be really interesting to watch.
It'll be very interesting to watch. And it really does come full circle to what you described at the beginning. And yes, education and communication, and the need to learn the lessons from perhaps, your experience of going into certain areas of Africa in those exploratory days, and kind of, understanding that there would have perhaps been greater benefit to being more open and more clear with local people as to exactly what was going on. So I think that's a really nice way, Lucy, to bring full circle back to the beginning of our conversation on this. Very interesting. So I want to conclude now with our magic wand question. So Lucy, if I was to hand you a magic wand, you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
See, this is a really difficult question. And I've been trying to put quite a lot of thought into how I can come up with a succinct answer to it.
Don't worry about succinct. Come on, give us the full picture.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to go for is non-negotiable transparency. Because I think that would drive a lot of change. I think if you've got to be completely transparent about what your actions are, so coming back to the El Salvador, for example, if people know that you knew about an environmental pollution incident and you hadn't taken any of the mitigation actions because you knew that there was a fault in your tailings dam, and then the tailings dam collapsed and you knew about it and then you didn't do anything about it, that's obviously going to have a really big impact on how people view you rather than if you change it. And I'm sure there's many more examples. I think coming back to what is the purpose of us doing things better? We want to make this planet better for the people and everybody else that we share it with. And climate change is arguably one of the biggest challenges that's facing us at the moment. As we speak, there's wildfires ravaging Los Angeles. We've had a freeze here in the UK. People are talking about flooding events that used to happen once every 10 years. Farmers are seeing that 3 or 4 times throughout the winter. The climate is changing. We know that it's being driven by the actions that we're taking as people. And we also know that we've got the technology and the expertise to do something really positive about that, so that for future generations, so for my small children, they will still have a world that's not completely on fire or frozen to live in. And I think with things like the wildfires in Los Angeles, all of a sudden it's bringing it much closer to home that these aren't just impacts that people far away are feeling. Our actions are something that maybe we need to start taking responsibility for ourselves. And I think if we're all being transparent about that, it might perhaps try and bridge that disconnect that I think a lot of people have in, Europe, North America. We don't realize that all of the actions we're taking actually have impacts elsewhere. Mining's a really obvious one. We haven't been extracting any metals in the UK for decades, really, apart from tungsten for a few years down in Plymouth. But we actually consume vast amounts of material in technology compared to people in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. All of those minerals, our mobile phones got 2/3 of the elements of the periodic table in it. Those have all been extracted from different mines around the world. They've then been shipped somewhere where they've been refined. They've been built into the technology. They arrive at our door and we're like, oh, that's great. We'll use the internet and we'll send WhatsApps. And isn't that lovely? Not thinking about all the ramifications that had. And so maybe if things are more transparent, people will be more aware of what they're consuming, what impacts it has, and also where the opportunities are for them to actually maybe change the way that they're living and thinking and maybe make a positive difference.
Here. I love the notion of, a non-negotiable transparency, non-negotiable radical transparency. I think that there's so much value in that. I think you're spot on. I think we as individuals need to have the uncomfortable truth presented to us, and it is happening. It is happening. You're right. I think every time another instance of the LA fires occurs, and it becomes, I think the Spanish floods last year in Valencia were another one. They just feel like they are getting closer. They're getting more aligned to certainly if we're sort of talking about us in the UK, we're seeing a more familiarity in the instances of what's going on. Lucy, that was absolutely brilliant. A whistle stop tour, I know, but we pretty much nailed on our timings for the show. It was great to have you on. Thank you so much for your time this Friday morning.
Thank you so much for having me. It's fascinating to chat to you.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Lucy Crane, ESG and Sustainability Manager at Cornish Lithium, for joining us for today's episode. We explored the recent developments in El Salvador's controversial decision to lift its material mining ban and how it ties to broader conversations about sustainability, community impact, and the future of responsible mining practices. This episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing ethical, sustainable communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.